Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Julie. It's nice to be here together. I'm thinking a lot about the end of that bio as this will not be one of my many summers at Ramah camps. So I'm glad to have the opportunity for some summer teaching and learning here with you. This is week 3 of 4 sessions on a course that's called What is God? Perspectives from the 20th Century. If you've been with us, we looked at Abraham Joshua Heschel and Mordechai Kaplan. And this week we'll be talking about Harold Kushner, and next week Judith Plaskow. 4 different perspectives from the 20th century about what is God, and 4 people who came to thinking about God and theology from very different places. And that's what I want to start with today, to talk a little bit about Harold Kushner and how he came to writing. I have a visual aid, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, which he's written other books as well, but this was his first and really foundational in understanding his thought. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but the key word in the title here is when bad things happen to good people, and not why bad things happen to good people. We'll talk about that a little more later, but I wanted to note that here as well. Harold Kushner is an ordained conservative rabbi, worked in a synagogue setting for his career. He came to writing about theology from personal experience. The Kushners had a son, Aaron, who they noticed, he was their oldest son. They had a younger daughter. They noticed as the kids started to grow that their younger daughter seemed to be developing at a little quicker pace than her older brother. And as they started to look into it, they found out that Aaron had a rare disease that caused him to age fast, and a rapid aging disease called progeria. They did what they could to support Aaron and make his life as comfortable and happy and enjoyable as it could be. Not so long after Aaron finished middle school did he succumb to the disease and die. And it was that life experience that was life-changing for Harold Kushner, not just as a person, but as a rabbi. I personally can't imagine the tragedy of losing a child, and losing a child to a disease that becomes painfully it becomes painful in the way in which it just limits what the child is able to do, and of course the full lifespan. What Kushner encountered as he was going through the mourning process was that people who approached him and his wife and their family to offer words of condolences and comforting thoughts offered to him some of the same bits of advice and wisdom that he as a rabbi had shared with people in his congregation as they suffered losses of all kinds. And he discovered that what he was hearing reflected towards what he was hearing in people sharing with him, that in which he heard echoes of his own grief counseling. He found much of what he was hearing both very lacking and also not helpful in terms of him dealing with the crisis of faith and the grief that he was dealing with. And that led him to think a lot about that, which led him to write and produce this book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and change his whole approach to grief counseling and working with others. So he comes to it from a very personal place. There's a way in which his personal story, which is in the introduction to this book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, really set him off on a journey and was foundational to him. And I know as a reader of the book, it speaks to the reader in terms of the emotions that are a part of that as well. That's introduction part 1. At the start of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, Kushner lays out in brief form the story of Job. Job is a biblical book from the end of the Bible. In summary, it sort of works like this. Job is a good person, does what is right in God's eyes. And he is blessed. He has a wife, he has many children, he has riches, he has comforts, he is well respected. And as the story goes in the biblical book of Job, the Satan, the adversary to God in this story, representing anti-God, I guess, comes to God and says, and challenges God to say, I see that your servant Job is very loyal to you, and you have blessed him with many gifts. But it's my belief that Job would not keep his faith, his commitment, his good standing, his commitment to you, God, if he did not have all the blessings that come with it. And much to the surprise of readers, maybe, or if you know the book of Job, you wouldn't be surprised. God is baited by this challenge from Satan, and says, Job, he stands by Job and says, Job will stick with me no matter what happens to him. Do with him what you will. Job will not lose his faith. What the book reports is then Job's family dies. He loses his wealth. He loses his standing. He even becomes diseased so that he has skin rashes that itch. He becomes physically uncomfortable. Lo and behold, though, God was right. Job does keep his faith. Much of the book, what I just described is really the introduction to the book of Job, the first couple chapters. Much of the book of Job is a very difficult biblical text where Job's friends come to speak to him to try to talk to him about the situation that he's in. Job gives some speeches as well, and at the end we hear from God. But all of the chapters of the book of Job, those get really dense and complex. For Kushner, they're less relevant. For Kushner, the book of Job is a good case study for the dilemma that he was experiencing, that led him to think about God and theology, especially in the face of crisis faith that comes from things not working out totally well. That's introduction part 2. So what we're going to do is the following. In a minute, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to look at a brief text from the beginning of the book. I'll explain what that is. If you want to see the text and have it with you after I'm done sharing my screen, in the chat function, there's a link to the source sheet on Google Docs that will allow you to split your windows and see it the whole time. If not, you'll see the beginning. I'm going to leave it up for a little bit because after we look at the text, I'm going to ask you to do your own reflective exercise. And then, Julie just reposted the source sheet if you logged on after it was posted. But we'll be able to open up and have a little discussion after we see what's in the text, the quote we're going to see from Kushner, and we'll see where that takes us. All right, so I'm going to start, sorry. I went to my document before sharing the screen. Here we go, I'm going to start sharing the screen. 3, 2, 1, here we go. So in response to the story that comes in the book of Job, Kushner puts out the following statement that you now see on your screen. I'm wondering, as Julia foreshadowed, if there's someone who would be so good as to read this for us so you can hear someone else's voices besides just mine. I'd love to have a volunteer to read the statement. So volunteer in the chat. Julie will help by calling on you, and then you can unmute yourself and read for us, please.
Okay, Natalia.
Thank you, Natalia.
Three statements which everyone in the book of Job and most of the readers would like to believe. God is all-powerful and causes everything that happens in the world. Nothing happens without God willing it. God is just and fair. and stands for people getting what they deserve so that the good prosper and the wicked are punished. Job is a good person.
All right, thank you for that. Kushner would add, it's not just that the people who read the book of Job and the characters in it who would like to believe these. He also puts out there that in his education growing up, these were things he was taught as well. He was taught about God being an all-powerful entity who's responsible for what happens in the world, and that the world follows God's plan, so that what happens in the world, God must support it in some way, shape, or form. He was also brought up on the second principle: God is just and fair and wants people to get what they deserve. So the good should prosper, and the wicked should be punished. And lastly, right here for the book of Job, Job is presented as a good person. And the dilemma of Job occurs for us in the world where we know people who are good, who are suffering. And so there becomes some tension between these statements. And Kushner in his own life felt this uniquely in terms of his son Aaron and his illness, which started at a very young age. He knew his son and all the goodness in him, and given his youth and his suffering, saw that it seemed quite unfair to Kushner and undeserving that a child so young, he couldn't imagine, especially his own child, not being a good person and somehow deserving the fate which he received. So I'm leaving these three statements on the screen for a moment, and I'm posing to you the following question to think about for a minute. And as we've done the last couple of weeks, if you have a paper or a pen, or you can type on your computer, a way to jot down some notes to the question I'm going to ask you, that'd be great. And then I'd love to hear from 2 or 3 people from the crowd to see some of the responses. So you each have your own response, and you'll get to hear a few others to the following, which I'll share with you right now. Kushner's theology and the work that he did in theology comes in response to looking at these 3 statements. And it's his argument, which he spells out more in detail in the book, that while the characters of the book and we as readers of the book would like to believe all 3 of these statements, they don't sit with each other given that Job is suffering, or given that innocent people in the world suffer. And Kushner puts out the question and says, given that all 3 of these statements cannot be true at the same time, we each must choose which is the one we're going to set aside. So I pose that to you to ponder a little bit. Given these 3 statements, if you had to set one aside to find a path towards a comfortable, more consistent theology, which one would it be and why? I'll say that one more time, and then I'll give you 3 minutes to think about it. And after those 3 minutes, I'm going to close down the shared screen, and I'll come back. So the prompt again is as followed. Given that these 3 statements can't all be true, given that Job is suffering, which one would you be most comfortable setting aside to allow for a belief system that's more consistent with how the world works? And I'm going to give you 3 minutes to think about that. And Julie, I could ask, while I'm sharing my screen, I don't have access to the chat. So if there are clarifying questions, I'd appreciate it if you can help share them. And otherwise, I'll give you the time to write and reflect.
So far, just opinions in the chat, not.
Okay, opinions are good. People have a chance to share coming soon. All right, we are into our third minute. So if you're done reflecting, great. If you're still writing or thinking, try to wind down your thought process, and we're going to start to come back together. Okay. All right. I have in my chat, I don't know if most of the chats are going to you, Julie. I have Deb from Boston chatted to me privately. I'm not sure, Deb, are you willing to share a little bit from what's in the chat? All right, I got you happen to be on my screen too, so you want to unmute yourself, Deb, and share with us what you shared in the chat? No?
Yes.
Okay, there you go.
I would set aside B, because a lot of things happen in the world that we don't have the foresight to know about. And also B is a bit kindergartnerish, like, you know, kumbaya. Everything is very simple, A, B, C. And that's not the way the world works. More subtle, much more subtle.
Okay, thank you for that. Setting aside B. Appreciate that. Is there someone else who wants to share their thoughts in response to this prompt?
There's a few participants with raised hands.
Oh, great.
So Joan, then Eunice. Joan?
Thank you. If I recall, and I've read most of Kushner's books, but it's been a few years. His response of those was that the way he could finally reconcile himself to what happened to his son was that God is not all powerful, that we have a partnership. But God is not all powerful. God is compassionate. God is the ultimate comforter. God is the person, just as I'm a chaplain, who wants to be with you along the path that you are on. You can tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm not remembering correctly, but that's what I believe he believed.
You are correct. Kushner drops A of the three choices, and we'll circle to that, back to that in a little bit. But thank you for that. You are right in that analysis. And we'll have more to say about that in a minute.
Eunice?
But thank you, Joan. Eunice, go ahead.
Eunice, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
I said I have a hard time believing all statements, all three of them.
Wow.
I keep asking, why do bad things happen to good people? I mean, we all have problems and things happening to us in life, and I'm not any different than anyone else, I'm sure. But I keep asking that same question over and over again, and I just can't find an answer. There's too much happening in this world that it's so difficult to understand. It's hard I believe there is a God who directs us, but I just don't understand it. And I keep looking for an answer. I don't know whether you have, nobody has the answer, I'm sure.
All right. Thank you for that. It is this question about good people, innocent people suffering is a major challenge to people in life and to theologians and people who want to live a religious life, people who want to live an ethical life. One thing, I will say, you know, I guess, spoiler alert, I don't have some magic answer for the end to make it all work out. Kushner has some helpful thoughts, which we'll talk about over the time we have left today, but he also doesn't solve all of these problems. I do want to point one thing out to the people who have been with us for the last 2 weeks. And just to contrast Kushner and how he comes to this theological conversation with Heschel and Kaplan. If you've been with us, you'll know that first, both Heschel and Kaplan talk about your engagement with God comes not from reason and logic, but from faith and experience in the world. And here, in what we're looking at right now, is a very basic, logical, reasonable paradigm that Kushner puts out there. And he says, if you look at this dilemma about innocent people suffering, you have to look at 3 different statements and choose which one you want to drop. And as you think this through with this paradigm, that will help you get somewhere. It's totally a different approach. You also might have noticed that we only looked at small passages from each of the thinkers. His language is much more straightforward and plain spoken. And his writing is much more accessible to people. And he's dealing with something that we all encounter in some way, shape, or form. So anyways, thank you for that comment. And I wanted to share those responses. Steve, I see you're one of the hands that are raised. Do you want to unmute yourself and share with us your comment?
Sure. I'm from East Brunswick, New Jersey.
Oh, welcome. Right around the corner.
Practically. I also reject statement A. God is powerful, but not all powerful. He does not control people's free will and decisions on what they want to do, nor does he control our response to catastrophes or misfortunes. How we respond is really up to us. So A just disappears.
That puts you squarely in Kushner's camp, that A disappears.
Yep.
And Kushner will talk a lot about, and this quote comes from page 37. There's 150 or so pages to go in this book. He will talk a lot about the human response and God's presence in it moving forward. But I think he would agree with you that it's in part how we respond to those moments of when life just seems unfair or unjust, that are important parts of an important thing to focus on. So thank you for that. I want to take one more comment. I see Liz Ornstein, you have your hand raised. You want to unmute yourself and share?
Yeah, well, I have to say, when I first read Kushner's book, it was not just enlightening, it was very relieving for me because I agreed with him completely. So I also would dismiss A, because it seems to me that too many, well, a couple of things. First of all, if God truly can control everything, and some of the stuff that happens, I cannot buy, well, we can't understand why 6 million people died in the Holocaust. It's God had some special, I just don't go there. And I've often been known to say, I'm not interested in that God. So that's one thing. And secondly, I also reject A because if in fact God controls everything that's done, how can God hold us accountable for anything? Why do we have Yom Kippur? God made me do it, The devil made me do it, right? If I can't control anything, if God ultimately has control, I'm free and clear. Whatever happens, I was made to do, and that's it.
Nice. Right. Thank you for that.
Sure.
I appreciate that. That second part of your comment about if God really controls everything, we can't be held accountable for our own actions. That's a part and parcel of Kushner's theology. It's also articulated very well in Maimonides' writings about Shuvah and repentance around Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and the high holidays. So that's a perspective not just from the 20th century, but also goes back to Maimonides, 12th century. I hope I got I might be 12th century plus or minus 1 century. I didn't look it up right before, so I think it's 12th century, where Maimonides lays that out pretty clearly, that the whole notion in Judaism that we're responsible for our actions means that we believe that, well, God might be powerful, there are limits to that power, and one of those limits is our own free will. And the reason why we're accountable for our actions is because God, in fact, does not intervene in them, in our actions in particular. Kushner does what some of you said, and for the same reasons. He looks at these 3 statements and thinks about not what ultimately he should conclude that God is based on some notions about God, but makes his choice about which is the God that he wants to believe in. Kushner first isn't in a position to challenge Job, saying, well, maybe there are things Job did wrong that we didn't know. And some of that is how he came to this from his own personal experience. He knows his son did not deserve the fate that he received, and there's some injustice about that. And in the scenario here where Job is the stand-in for his own personal tragedy, he's not going to drop statement C. And forced to choose between A and B, would I rather believe in a God who's not just and fair, or would I rather believe in a God that's all-powerful? He's going to choose the God that's not all-powerful. And I don't know, Deb, going back to your comment from the, I think you spoke first, in part, what Kushner nuances about statement B is well, he agrees that it's too simple, like you said, that to say the world should work out, the good should get, what's due, and the people who are evil should get what's due. And well, he acknowledges that's not the world we live in, but he puts God aspirationally in the same camp that we're in. We would like things to work out justly. And the reason why we can't hold God accountable for not making it work out that way is that he drops A. God is not in control of everything that happens in the world, but God's on our side in wanting it to be that way. And in Kushner's view, God is with us when we confront those moments where things are not working out for us individually, in our families, in society. And in that sense, there's an echo in Kushner of Mordechai Kaplan, who we looked at last week. If you were here with us, Kaplan's theology said that God is the power that helps us at times of trouble and leads us towards salvation and a better life. And Kushner, who was a student of Kaplan's at some point, comes out, his theology is in that place too, is that God is partially there to give us the strength as we encounter some of the tragedies that we face. So that's a few, I'm getting a few different thoughts coming in. Yes. This is, Deb notes that this is a very nuanced conversation, and I would say we can, in the 45 minutes that we'll be together today, we can't do Kushner justice. I will say that the works that we looked at the last 2 weeks, while they are both wonderful reads and would help you dig your, and if you're interested in them, digging into them would be great. Although you have to set aside some time to get through Heschel's Man is Not Alone and Kaplan's The Future of the American Jew. But one of the wonderful things about Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People is, depending on the speed that you read, could be 1, 2, or 3 Shabbat afternoons, and you've read through the book. And there's a way in which it's really accessible in the way he writes it, that if you're looking for follow-up and to get to know him more, it's a good thing to read. All right, let me pause at this point right here and see if there are questions that have emerged this far that people would like to make. And if you have a question or comment you'd like to add, you're going to, again, raise your hand in the chat, and or we can read it out. So I have a note from Debbie. How does God give us strength? That's a great question, Debbie. And I want to say, to a certain extent, there's, depending where you are with that, there's some mystery to that. I want to try to speak to the extent that I can through Kushner's vision of that. And some of it echoes what I just said. In Kushner's view, right, God is within the process of our encountering the struggles of injustice that we have in the world, the ways that things that don't work out. The strength that we find when we're dealing with personal illness or illness of a family member, the strength that we find to help us be motivated to act in response to injustice in the world and things that don't work out in society. Kushner, in part like Kaplan, would label that as a place where we can find God in it. Kushner also talks about how God can act through the actions of other people. The person who's able to sit with someone who is facing injustice or an unfair circumstances, we can find God in other people who are there to support us. So sometimes we find God not because God is helping, but because other people are helping as well. I would say this also in terms of your question, and one of the reasons why I find when bad things happen to good people to be a real useful tool, which is the following. What Kushner spends more time writing about is not specifically the answer to that question, how does God help us? How does God give us strength? But looks at many of the reasons that often people say to people who've just lost a loved one, or people who are dealing with grief, or people who are dealing with one of these situations. And Kushner writes about how many of the things that people said to him were not, which are part of tradition, and explains why those things were not helpful to him. And in hopes that we will find better ways to support each other. Two examples about that I would share. One comes, Kushner talks about this in the book. Many people, when confronting someone who's mourning at the loss of a loved one, will say something like, they're in a better place. And they mean that, when people say that, they sometimes mean that coming from a good place, because they want to say somehow you should feel comfort that the person who has passed on is either not feeling pain anymore from the illness that they were in, or somehow in heaven or in God's presence, which is more comfortable. Kushner found it hard to hear that, and if you're like him and have been in those situations, your loss is not lessened by the fact that someone's suggesting that the person's in a better place, so he found that answer to be totally not satisfying. And some of what he's able to do in the chapters of the book is to sort of go through things that we find ourselves saying and to work through why they're not always as helpful as we think they might be, and why they sometimes get us stuck and lead us to places that aren't theologically productive. Anyways, that's one example. I see there are more questions. So instead of a second example, let's hear some other voices. Julie, you had someone you said you wanted to point to.
Yes, Steve is asking, well, first he references Regina Spektor's song. I don't know if you know the song, "No one laughs at God in a hospital, no one laughs at God in a war." And sort of its idea that everyone turns to God when things are going badly. And Steve is wondering if you can address why more people don't turn to God when things are going well, like on a daily basis, and as an affirmation of faith.
That's a great question, right? There are times, someone last week said that too. There's the theology about there are no atheists in foxholes, right? When bullets are raining down on you, and that's a time where you might turn to God. And I would say this first: people might not laugh at God in the hospital. There are certain times where these moments of crisis sometimes push people away from God. Right? Someone in their comment earlier talked about, right, the Holocaust as an injustice of all injustices, where was a 20th century crisis of faith for many people because their theology that God should intervene to protect the Jewish people did not intervene in that situation. Many people walked away from God and religion in response to the Holocaust and other tragedies like that. And sometimes that happens personally as well. I think some of that, to the question, right, why might we turn to God at hard times more than at easy times, in part has to do with the secular society that we live in. Right, there are parts of America that are very religious society, that you could say are religious society. There are parts of America that are secular society. I think it's easier for when things are going well for us to turn away from theology. I want to echo back a couple weeks. Some of what Heschel said and what we looked at was part of Heschel's argument is that we in general aren't aware enough of God's presence in the world so that we're not turning to God enough. And I think some of the challenge for us in the 21st century is as individuals to find space for God in our lives and find ways to turn to it, especially if some of the things we learned about God growing up don't seem to work. Right? That's some of Kushner's dilemma. Some of the things he was taught to believe about God, that he believed about God, and then as a rabbi taught about God, did not work for him when he faced the tough moments. Finding the ways to find models to think about God that can help us integrate God into our lives, both at the tough times and at the easy times, is not easy work. And I know for me as a rabbi and a teacher, I don't think, and a Jewish educator, I don't think we spend enough time on Jewish theology in our schools and with adult education. And I think it was Steve, maybe, if I'm remembering right. I forgot the name wrong. I'm sorry. And asking that question, you're pointing to, I think, a real issue that we need to be thinking theologically in more spheres of our lives, at times of blessing and at times of pain. I have a note that says, it's also comforting to believe we had a hand in our success, and then when we fail, it's because the world, God, simply would not let us succeed. I like that, right? When things are going well, we like to take credit for it. When things are not going well, we like to find a source for that. That's a nice psychological piece that might explain the different people's different approaches to religion. All right, Julie, do you have another question in the chat? I think we're getting different streams of the chat.
Carrie? Carrie, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
There we go.
I just did. I just wanted to add, it's from my note, from studying the Torah, I believe that the Torah doesn't support either premise A or premise B. The God of the Torah is certainly not omnipotent, and the God is a self-described jealous God, but not necessarily a just God.
True. It's interesting, right? So this course focuses on perspectives from the 20th century, but you're right to take us back many more centuries than that. There are things that people believe today that they would say these are deeply rooted Jewish beliefs and have always been Jewish beliefs, right? Jewish belief is far less consistent, I would say, than Jewish practice. And there are lots of Jewish beliefs from different eras that are stronger in one era and less strong in other eras. And you're right, the God of the Torah is not all-knowing. We see that from the very first stories in the Garden of Eden. The God of the Torah is not all-powerful. We see God disappointed all the time with people not doing what God wants them to do. God is reliant on the prophets to try to get God's message out into the world. as opposed to projecting it God's self. There are lots of theological questions that come out of the Bible. And you're right, these statements that Kushner puts out that says the reader of Job wants to believe, well, maybe today, but the reader of Job in the 5th century, maybe not. So very astute there to think about it. It's easy for us to think about beliefs that are in vogue today must have go back, millennia. Some do, some come and go, but different belief systems come from different times. And Gary, that's a very astute comment. I'm glad you brought that up. If you're interested, he didn't make the cut for this perspective from the 20th century, but if you're interested in a really powerful and accessible description of God of the Bible, I would refer you to a book by Jack Miles called God, a Biography. I really like this book for a couple reasons. First, it won the Pulitzer Prize. Jack Miles is not by training a biblical scholar, he was a journalist, studied the Bible though, wrote this book. It made me forever endeared to the Pulitzer Prize people, because a book on biblical theology that was called God, a Biography, won the Pulitzer Prize in biography. And I love that, but it's a wonderful book that does some of the analysis that Carrie was hinting at. We could have looked at that as well if we had an infinite number of weeks. All right, I see another comment that says, right, there are many different names for God in Judaism and throughout the Torah. It's true. My teacher, Rabbi Neil Gilman, who we also aren't going to have a chance to look at in this course, talked a lot about how God language by nature is metaphorical. And we choose to use different metaphors for God at different times in our life and at different times in the existence of our people. And different ones work at different times. But our tradition is rich in thinking about God and thinking about God in lots of different ways. All right, we are at 3:45, which is the end of our time together. I'll hold up my visual aid once upon a time. I'd say one more time. When bad things happen to good people. I hope on my screen of me, it's backwards. I hope you have I hope I'm getting the mirror image and you're getting it forward. All right, getting some thumbs up. When bad things happen to good people, it's probably available as a digital book and an e-reader as well. Because I know I don't have a lot of access to either my synagogue or public library. This as well. Oh, someone said audio by the author, Kushner reading it himself. I'll close with this. Kushner is, I went to check his bio just to make sure I had the details down. Kushner's in the middle of his 9th decade. He's 85 years old this year. I just 2 or 3 years ago got to see him teach and speak in person. One of the differences between him and it'll be true next week as well, but the first two theologians we looked at are no longer with us. Kushner is still with us, which when I taught Kushner's book in a theology course to seniors in high school, they're always curious about that. Every once in a while I would come back from a conference and say, I saw Harold Kushner and got to study with him. It was wonderful. And they said, Rabbi Goldberg, that can't be. He's in the curriculum. He must be no longer with us. And I said, no, he is alive and well. Next time I see him, I will let him know that you are glad he's still with us. But Kushner's thinking in this book has been helpful to many, many people in times of personal and global struggle. And as a teacher of rabbis and as a congregational rabbi and a model to others, he has transformed the way rabbis in all denominations have really dealt with grief in their own lives and in the lives of the people that they serve. I would say this, the best time to read this book is before you're facing the toughest of the personal situations that you're going to face in life. It's one of the reasons I like to teach it to teens, so that they get to, before, not that all teens are immune from tragedy, but the longer you live, the more likely you are to confront one of those hard moments. I like to get this book in people's hands as early as they're able to read it and deal with the issues that are there. So as we're a multi-generational group on this class, I recommend this book to you, but if you have children or even grandchildren who are of the Kushner reading age, not a bad book to recommend or to slip into someone's bookshelf or Hanukkah present. You want to put a happy thing in there too. Anyways, thank you for being with us today. I appreciate it. As I see how many screens of you there are as I flip through, it's a growing class, and I appreciate that. It feels good to have more people show up. I could say as a teacher, it's harder and harder for me to have a bigger and bigger group that, we're really, not only are we socially distanced, but we're digitally distanced. So I hope it's working for you in this digital classroom. I'm getting some visual thumbs up and some thumbs up in the chat, so thank you for that. We'd love to find ways to be more interactive where we can. But thank you for being with us. Next week at this time, Judith Plaskow, a different voice, and our first female voice. It was important to me to not have an all-male panel. So Plaskow is coming. She has some interesting things to say. Some of you might have heard of her and some might not, but we'll meet her next week. Anyway,